Edward Dawson sat in the large, dimly lit study of his mansion, surrounded by the echoes of a life that once brimmed with joy and purpose. The grand room, with its high ceilings and ornate furnishings, felt like a mausoleum to him now. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with volumes he no longer had the will to read, and the fireplace, once a source of warmth and comfort, had gone cold. Edward had been a different man when Eleanor was alive. She was the light in his life, the one who brought meaning to his days. Together they had built a life full of love, laughter, and shared dreams. But when she passed away suddenly 2 years ago, that light had gone out, leaving Edward in darkness. Since then, he had retreated from the world, isolating himself in his mansion, where the only company he kept were the memories of a time long gone. He spent his days in a monotonous routine, wandering from room to room, trying to escape the suffocati. His evenings were spent staring out the large bay window in his study, looking out at the world he no longer felt a part of. It was during one of these solitary vigils that Edward first noticed the boy. The child, no older than 6 or 7, was playing in the park that bordered Edward's estate. The park had been one of Eleanor's favorite places. They used to walk there together, hand in hand, during the early years of their marriage. Seeing the boy there now, so full of life and innocence, stirred something in Edward that he hadn't felt in a long time. The child reminded him of the family he and Eleanor had always wanted, but never had. Edward found himself drawn to the window every day, watching as the boy, whose name he later learned was Tommy, played in the park. The boy's laughter, carried on the breeze through the open window, echoed in Edward's mind, filling the emptiness that had taken root in his heart. It was a small flicker of something he couldn't quite place, a memory perhaps, or the faintest whisper of hope. One afternoon, as Edward watched from his window, he saw Tommy running through the park, his small legs carrying him with a carefree abandon. The boy was chasing after a ball, his eyes bright with excitement. But in his haste, Tommy tripped over a tree root and fell hard to the ground. Edward's heart skipped a beat as he saw the boy clutch his knee, his face scrunched up in pain. Without thinking, Edward sprang from his chair. It was the first time in months that he had moved with such urgency. He hurried down the grand staircase, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls and out the front door. As he crossed the manicured lawn toward the park, he could hear Tommy crying softly. When Edward reached the boy, he knelt down beside him. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle but laced with concern. Tommy looked up at him, tears brimming in his wide, innocent eye. "It hurts," the boy whispered, holding out his scraped knee. Edward's heart ached at the sight. He carefully examined the injury. It wasn't too serious, just a scrape, but it was enough to bring tears to a young boy's eyes. "You'll be okay," Edward assured him, pulling out a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbing at the wound. "Let's get you up." As he helped Tommy to his feet, a woman came rushing over. "Tommy. Oh, Tommy, are you all right?" She was out of breath, her face flushed with worry. Edward looked up to see a young woman, likely in her early 30s, with the same bright eyes as Tommy. This must be his mother, Edward thought. "I'm okay, Mommy," Tommy sniffled, clutching Edward's hand as he stood. The woman, Sophie, introduced herself with a grateful smile, her anxiety giving way to relief. "Thank you so much for helping him," she said, her voice warm despite the tension in her expression. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been here." Edward nodded, feeling an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. "I'm just glad I could help," he replied, glancing down at Tommy, who was now standing a bit taller, the tears drying on his cheeks. As Sophie and Tommy walked back toward the park gate, Edward found himself standing there watching them go. The encounter had stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't felt since Eleanor's passing. It was as if, in helping this small boy, he had momentarily stepped out of the shadow of his cry. He had felt useful again, if only for a brief moment. And as he turned to walk back to his mansion, Edward realized that perhaps this was the beginning of something new. Something that might, in time, bring meaning back to his life. Edward Dawson found himself drawn to the park more frequently after that day. What started as occasional glances from his window evolved into daily visits. He would walk the short distance from his mansion to the park, where he often found Tommy playing, his laughter a balm to Edward's wounded soul. The boy's innocence and boundless energy reminded Edward of the life he once had, a life that seemed like a distant dream now. One afternoon, as Edward sat on a bench watching Tommy chase after a kite, his mind drifted to memories of Eleanor. He remembered their early days together, how they'd met at a charity event she had organized. Eleanor had been full of life, her laughter infectious, and her kindness unmatched. They had fallen in love quickly, their bond growing stronger with each passing year. Edward had always thought they would grow old together, but fate had other plans. The flashbacks were vivid, almost like reliving the moments. He could see Eleanor's smile, hear her voice, and feel the warmth of her hand in his. The pain of losing her was still sharp, like a wound that had never fully healed. Edward's internal dialogue was a constant battle between the overwhelming grief that had consumed him for years and the faint glimmer of hope that Tommy and Sophie had unknowingly reignited within him. He remembered the day they had found out that Eleanor was sick. It had been a sudden and cruel twist of fate. She had always been so full of life, and yet, within months, she was gone. Edward had tried to stay strong for her, but when she passed, a part of him died with her. He had retreated into himself, shutting out the world, convinced that life no longer held any meaning. But now, sitting on that bench, watching Tommy's carefree joy, Edward felt something stir within him. It was a small, fragile feeling, a sense of purpose that he had thought lost forever. His interactions with Tommy were simple yet profound. The boy would run up to him with questions about the world, eager to learn and explore, and Edward found himself enjoying the role of a mentor, a guide. It was a role he had never had the chance to play, as Eleanor and he had never been blessed with children. One day, as Tommy sat beside him on the bench, holding a newly constructed model airplane, Edward felt a surge of affection for the boy. "You know, Tommy," Edward said, his voice soft, "I used to build these with my father when I was your age." Tommy looked up at him, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Really? Did your dad teach you how to make them fly?" Edward smiled, nodding. "He did. And I'd be happy to teach you too if you'd like." Tommy's face lit up with excitement. "Yes, please, I want to learn everything." As they spent more time together, Edward found that his days were no longer filled with the same crushing loneliness. Instead, there was a new rhythm to his life, one that included teaching Tommy how to fly model planes, taking him fishing at the nearby lake, and sharing stories of his own childhood. These simple yet meaningful moments brought Edward a sense of joy he hadn't felt in years. Yet even as he enjoyed these moments, Edward's internal struggle continued. He feared getting too close, too attached. What if he lost them too? What if the pain of losing Eleanor repeated itself? These fears gnawed at him, but as much as he tried to distance himself, he couldn't deny the bond that was forming between him, Tommy, and Sophie. The more time Edward spent with Tommy and Sophie, the more he began to see them as more than just acquaintances. They were becoming a part of his life, a new, unconventional family. Tommy, with his endless questions and bright smile, had wormed his way into Edward's heart. And Sophie, with her quiet strength and resilience, had become someone Edward deeply respected and cared for. Sophie had been hesitant at first, unsure of Edward's intentions. She was used to handling everything on her own, from working multiple jobs to make ends meet to raising Tommy without any help. But Edward's kindness and patience slowly broke down her walls. She found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't with anyone else since Tommy's father had left. Edward never pried, never asked too many questions. He simply listened, offering a comforting presence that Sophie had sorely missed. Their friendship grew stronger with each passing day. Edward would invite Sophie and Tommy over for dinner, filling his once-empty dining room with laughter and conversation. He taught Tommy how to fish, patiently showing him how to cast a line and reel in a catch. Tommy's excitement was infectious, and even Sophie, who had never been one for fishing, found herself enjoying the peaceful afternoons by the lake. Sophie also began to rely on Edward in small ways. She appreciated his advice, whether it was about Tommy's schooling, or how to fix a leaky. Edward, in turn, found solace in Sophie's company. She was someone who understood loss and hardship, and their shared experiences created a bond that was both comforting and healing. As the days turned into weeks, the dynamics between them solidified into something more than just friendship. Tommy looked up to Edward as a grandfatherly figure, often running to him with his problems or seeking his approval. Sophie, who had always prided herself on her independence, found herself leaning on Edward's support, grateful for the kindness he offered so freely. Edward's mansion, once a symbol of his isolation, began to feel like a home again. It was filled with the sounds of life: Tommy's laughter, Sophie's voice, and the warm, comforting hum of shared meals and quiet evenings. The bond between the three of them grew stronger with each passing day, creating a new family unit that brought light back into Eddie. For the first time in years, Edward felt that his life had meaning again. He had found a new purpose in being there for Tommy and Sophie, in helping them navigate the challenges of life, and in being a part of their small but loving family. It wasn't the life he had once envisioned, but it was one he cherished all the same. Edward Dawson had never expected to care so deeply for anyone again, let alone for a young boy and his mother who had only recently entered his life. But as days turned into weeks, his bond with Tommy and Sophie grew stronger. With that attachment, however, came a growing sense of unease. Edward found himself lying awake at night staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of what could go wrong. The grief of losing Eleanor had nearly destroyed him, and the thought of experiencing that kind of pain again terrified him. He was no longer the strong, resilient man he had once been. The years of isolation had left him fragile, and while Tommy and Sophie had brought a renewed sense of purpose into his life, they had also reopened old wounds. What if he became too attached? What if he let them into his heart, only to lose them too? These questions haunted Edward, making him question whether he should continue being involved in their lives. Edward's fear was compounded by his self-doubt. He wondered if he was doing the right thing by staying close to Sophie and Tommy. He was an old man, set in his ways, and they were a young, struggling family. Perhaps it would be better for everyone if he withdrew now, before any real harm was done. But every time he considered pulling away, the thought of Tommy's laughter and Sophie's grateful smile made him hesitate. He didn't want to lose the warmth they had brought into his life, but the fear of potential heartache kept gnawing at him. Meanwhile, Sophie had her own struggles. She had always been fiercely independent, taking pride in raising Tommy on her own despite the challenges. Accepting help from Edward had been difficult for her, even when it was something as simple as letting him teach Tommy how to fish or build model planes. She feared that she might be a burden to him, that he might expect something in return that she wasn't prepared to give. Sophie valued her independence, and while she appreciated Edward's kindness, she couldn't shake the feeling that relying on him too much could lead to complications she wasn't ready to face. Sophie's worries were compounded by the nagging fear that Edward might eventually expect more from their relationship. She knew he had lost his wife, and while she didn't believe he had any romantic interest in her, she was concerned about what her continued acceptance of his help might imply. Sophie didn't want to lead Edward on, nor did she want to create a situation where she felt indebted to him. This internal struggle made her hesitant to fully embrace the support he offered, even though she knew it would greatly benefit both her and Tommy. Tommy, blissfully unaware of the adult's internal conflicts, simply enjoyed the attention and care he received from Edward. To him, Edward was a kind, grandfatherly figure who made his days brighter and more exciting, but even Tommy, in his youthful innocence, could sense the tension between his mother and Edward. He didn't understand the cause, but he noticed the moments of awkward silence, the way his mother's smile sometimes faltered, and how Edward's laughter seemed forced at times. Tommy's intuitive nature made him worry, though he couldn't articulate exactly why. As these unspoken fears and doubts simmered beneath the surface, the once harmonious relationship between Edward, Sophie, and Tommy began to show signs of strain. Edward's fear of losing them, Sophie's pride and reluctance to fully accept his help, and Tommy's growing awareness of the tension all contributed to a sense of unease that threatened to unravel the bond they had worked so hard to build. The turning point came on a cold autumn evening when Sophie received a letter that sent her world awow. It was from her landlord, informing her that the rent for her small apartment was being raised beyond what she could afford. Sophie had been barely scraping by as it was, working multiple jobs to provide for Tommy, and the news hit her like a ton of bricks. Panic set in as she realized that she had no way of coming up with the extra money and no other affordable housing options available. Desperate, and with no one else to turn to, Sophie confided in Edward about her situation. She didn't want to burden him, but she felt she had no other choice. Edward listened quietly as she explained her predicament, his heart aching for her. He could see the fear in her eyes, the way she clutched Tommy's hand as if he might slip away from her at any moment. It reminded him of how he had felt when Eleanor had fallen ill, helpless, desperate to do something, anything, to make things better. Without hesitation, Edward offered to help. He told Sophie that he would cover the rent increase or even buy a small house for her and Tommy if she wanted. It was an easy decision for him. He had more than enough money, and it felt right to use it to help someone he cared about. But to his surprise, Sophie didn't immediately accept his offer. Instead, she hesitated, her pride and independence warring with her desperate need. "I don't want to feel like I'm taking advantage of you, Edward," Sophie said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "You've already done so much for us, and I don't want to take charity. I don't want to feel indebted to you." Edward was taken aback by her response. He had expected gratitude, perhaps even relief. But instead, he felt like his offer had been rejected. A part of him understood where Sophie was coming from. He admired her pride and independence. But another part of him felt hurt. He had only wanted to help, to make her life a little easier. But now it felt like his intentions were being questioned. The tension between them grew as Sophie's hesitation turned into a firm refusal. She insisted that she would find another way, even though Edward knew she had few options. He couldn't understand why she wouldn't accept his help when it was so clearly needed, and the frustration began to build within him. Edward, feeling rejected and unsure of what else to do, began to withdraw, questioning whether he had been foolish to think he could find a new purpose in their lives. The rift between them widened, and for the first time since they had met, Edward considered stepping back entirely. He wondered if he had been wrong to get involved, if his presence was doing more harm than good. The thought of losing the connection he had with Sophie and Tommy filled him with a deep sense of sadness. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow to blame for the tension that had developed. As the days passed, Edward found himself retreating back into the solitude he had known for so long, unsure if there was any way to repair the damage that had been done. The days had grown colder as winter approached, and with it came a sense of unease that settled deep in Edward's bones. He hadn't seen much of Sophie and Tommy in the past week. His retreat into solitude after their argument had left a void in his heart, one that he tried to ignore but couldn't. The thought of pulling away from them entirely had seemed like the right decision at the time, but now he wasn't so sure. Then, one evening, Edward received a frantic call from Sophie. Tommy had fallen seriously ill. What had started as a simple cold had rapidly escalated into something far more concerning. Sophie's voice trembled with fear as she explained that they were at the hospital, and she didn't know what to do. Without hesitation, Edward grabbed his coat and rushed to his car, his heart pounding with worry. When Edward arrived at the hospital, he found Sophie pacing in the waiting room, her face pale and drawn with anxiety. She looked up as he entered, and the relief that washed over her was palpable. "Edward," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't know who else to call. I'm so scared." Edward took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm here now. We'll get through this together," he assured her, though his own heart was heavy with fear. They sat together in the sterile, brightly lit waiting room, the minutes stretching into hours. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, a reminder of the time that seemed to drag on endlessly. Sophie leaned her head on Edward's shoulder, and for the first time since he had known her, she allowed herself to be vulnerable. The strong, independent woman he had admired was now a mother terrified for her child's life. "I don't know what I'd do if something happened to him," Sophie whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He's all I have, Edward. I can't lose him." Edward's heart ached as he listened to her. He could feel the weight of her fear, the desperation in her voice. It reminded him of the helplessness he had felt when Eleanor had fallen ill. But this time, he wasn't the one who needed saving. Sophie and in that moment, Edward knew he couldn't turn his back on them. They had become his reason for living, the light that had drawn him out of his darkness. "You won't lose him," Edward said firmly, though his voice wavered slightly. "Tommy is strong, just like you. And he's going to get through this. We're all going to get through this." As they waited for news from the doctors, Edward reflected on the choices he had made. He had been so afraid of getting hurt again that he had almost pushed away the very people who had brought meaning back into his life. The consequences of his actions were now clear. He could either stay and support Sophie and Tommy, or he could retreat back into his lonely existence. But the choice was no longer difficult. Edward knew that staying with them, being a part of their lives, was the only path forward. It was the choice that would bring healing, not just to them, but to himself as well. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor approached them with a tired but reassuring smile. "Tommy is stable now," he said. "It was touch and go for a while, but he's responding well to the treatment. He'll need to stay here for a few days, but we expect a full recovery." Sophie let out a sob of relief, clutching Edward's hand as if it were a lifeline. Edward felt his own eyes well with tears, a mixture of relief and gratitude overwhelming him. They had faced the darkest hour together, and they had come through it with a renewed sense of hope. The days that followed Tommy's illness were a turning point for Edward, Sophie, and Tommy. As Tommy slowly recovered in the hospital, the bond between the three of them grew stronger than ever. Edward was there every day, bringing small gifts to cheer Tommy up and comforting Sophie as she navigated the emotional turmoil of seeing her son so vulnerable. Sophie, who had always been hesitant to accept Edward's help, found herself leaning on him more than she ever thought possible. She realized that her pride had been standing in the way of something truly special, someone who cared for her and Tommy without expecting anything in return. As Edward sat by Tommy's bedside, telling the boy stories from his own childhood, Sophie saw not just a wealthy man offering charity, but a kind soul who had found a new purpose in being there for them. One afternoon, as Tommy slept peacefully, Sophie turned to Edward, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done," she said softly. "You've been here for us in ways I never expected, and I'm so grateful." Edward shook his head, a gentle smile on his face. "You don't have to thank me, Sophie. Being here, helping you and Tommy, it's given me something I didn't think I could ever have again. You've brought light back into my life." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of happiness. She reached out and took Edward's hand, holding it tightly. "You're a part of our family now, Edward. We need you just as much as you need us." From that moment on, the relationship between Edward, Sophie, and Tommy was no longer just one of convenience or necessity. It was one of true family. Edward finally found peace with his past, letting go of the guilt and sorrow that had haunted him since Eleanor's death. He realized that while he would always cherish the memories of his wife, his life didn't have to end with her passing. He had found a new reason to live, a new family to care for, and in doing so, he had also healed his own heart. As Tommy fully recovered, and they all returned to their routine, the once solitary mansion became a place of warmth and joy. Edward's home, which had been a symbol of his loneliness, was now filled with laughter, shared meals, and the simple pleasures of daily life. Sophie and Tommy brought a new energy into his world, and Edward's days were no longer spent in silent mourning, but in active, loving participation in the lives of those he now held dear. The story concludes with Edward sitting in his study one evening, a fire crackling in the hearth, the room filled with the comforting sounds of life. Tommy was playing with his model planes, and Sophie was reading by the fire. Edward looked around at the scene before him, a deep sense of contentment settling. He had found a second chance at happiness, and he had learned that it was never too late to make a difference in someone's life. In helping Sophie and Tommy, he had also helped himself, finding a new sense of purpose and a renewed will to live. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and leave your thoughts in the comments. I love reading them.